As I might have already mentioned, animal-sourced foods are a huge contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions, and we can see across multiple studies that they consistently have the highest greenhouse gas emissions, while plant-based foods often have a much smaller footprint. However, that also really depends. It's always important to also keep in mind local contexts and regional contexts.
Hi everyone and welcome back to ProVeg Talks. I'm very excited to be your host on this journey through the world of plant-based nutrition, food innovation, and all the exciting things happening in the food system. My name is Valentina Gallani. I'm a nutritionist and food technologist, and I work as a health and nutrition manager at ProVeg International. If you're new here, I would highly recommend checking our previous podcast episodes. We will cover different topics with guests from different backgrounds to better understand the relationship between nutrition, health, and sustainability with a plant-based perspective. So whether you are a long-term plant-based eater or just curious, you are in the right place. I highly recommend check our previous episode because we talk about vegan protein, alternative proteins, but also smart nutrition. And finally, today we are talking about sustainability. Today we have an environmental expert who works to make big data understandable for all of us, and he holds a Master of Science in Evolution, Ecology and Systematics. He's also one of my colleagues at ProVeg and works as a food system sustainability lead at ProVeg International. So a huge welcome to Daniel Braune. Hi Daniel, how are you today?
Hi, Valentina. I'm great, and I'm really looking forward talking to you. So thank you so much for having me.
Nice, thanks to you for being our guest today. Yeah, we work closely on different projects. I hope you will have fun today with us. And before starting, maybe can you give us an introduction of your background and what's your work in general?
Yeah, as you already mentioned, I'm an ecologist mostly. I studied biology and later evolution, ecology, and systematics with a big background on ecology and sustainability topics. I'm now working on the topic of food systems for over 10 years. When it comes to ProVeg, I started at ProVeg as a federal volunteer in 2016. And in 2017, I then created the research department at ProVeg with a background of providing the information with credible information, with data gathering, preparing data, and many more topics. Also with a main focus on sustainability, at least when it comes to my own role. And now I'm food system sustainability lead. Again, mostly focusing on the sustainability topics, mostly environmental topics, but also with a strong focus on data science, where I prepare data for the organization and also beyond.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's actually it's great to know a bit more about you because sometimes I don't know exactly what you have done in your previous life. Yes. So can I ask you the main reason why you started studying ecology and then I would say moving more into the sustainability topic?
Yeah, that's a great question. I decided for plant-based diet nearly 18 years ago now, and I think it was mostly for classical reasons such as animal welfare, but also there were some environmental concerns. And this switch was mostly during my transition from school to university, and I felt like this would be the perfect moment to make a change. I moved out from home, started new in a new city, and was in general also curious about doing something different, more or less. And I was also always interested in the interactions between us and the environment. And this switch made me even more interested and curious to learn more about this. So first I started to study chemistry, mainly with a background that I would love, or that I possibly dive deeper into biochemistry to understand processes at a more molecular level. But I also quickly realized that it would be nice and that it fascinated me even more or what fascinated me even more is the bigger picture. So how humans, animals, plants, and the ecosystems all interact with each other. And that's what eventually led me to study ecology. So sustainability was a big part of my motivation. But in the end, it's also not really about a single issue, but more about understanding the complex systems behind all of those issues.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing this. I feel like also for me it was pretty much the same. So I was also very interested in food biochemistry and in general, like how our body works with food and what happened there. But suddenly I start looking into more animal welfare and sustainability. And nowadays, for me as well, the big picture is definitely more interesting and more important than just looking at the small things, small details. And I think this is something that usually is not so common. So general people don't know how much is complicated the big picture, and especially on the pressure of our diet pose on the environment. So maybe can you explain this a bit more, like the connection between diet, environment, and sustainability?
And there are so many different connections, I think. I mean, as you might know, we all have to eat, and that ideally every day. Um, so this food we need to eat also needs to be produced. And I mean, you don't really see it when you are in the supermarket, but of course, producing this food requires huge amounts of resources. It requires a lot of energy. Um, and still, it's often a neglected topic, even though it's getting more and more attention now, which is great. And of course, when we need to produce food, this also has a huge impact on the environment because we need huge amounts or areas of land. I think one of the biggest issues might be the greenhouse gas emissions. As you might know, the global food system is responsible for about a third of global greenhouse gas emissions, which is enormous, and especially animal sourced foods play a major role in this. In total, greenhouse gas emissions from animal-based foods are twice that of plant-based foods. And there is even more. I mean, there are different greenhouse gases that are involved here, from carbon dioxide to methane, which is even more powerful than carbon dioxide and mostly emitted by ruminant animals. And we also see that switching towards more plant-based diets can reduce those emissions significantly in the
Mm-hmm.
end.
Yeah, this is crazy. I was reading, I read once that maybe is one of the easiest way to reduce our impact on the planet, on the gas emission.
It's
I don't
one
know
of the
if you.
biggest, it's one of the
Okay,
biggest
that's good.
impacts I would say you can do on a individual level, but also on a food system level.
Yeah. Yeah. And in terms of land, water use, because most of the people thinks just about exactly like pollution, gas emissions, so on. But we use a lot of water and land and soils to produce our food. What is the here like the connection between our diet and the sustainability problem we are having at the moment?
As I already mentioned, we need huge amounts of foods to um, feed the world. So this also requires huge amounts of land to grow crops, for example, or
Mhm.
to feed farmed animals such as cows. We need large areas of pasture land. A lot of
Mhm.
crops we grow are used as animal feeds. If we think about soy, for example,
Yeah.
75% of all soy is not eaten by humans directly, but indirectly via animals. Even so, and I think you would agree, it's a great source of protein to consume
Mhm.
directly.
Yeah.
Um, in total, we can say that, for example, animal-sourced foods use 80% of global land area, even though they only provide 37% of protein and 18% of calories. That's
Mhm.
quite enormous. And of course, the pressure on land from crop production, from pasture land, also has enormous impacts on biodiversity and ecosystems. If we think about deforestation,
Mhm.
in tropical areas, which does not only have an impact on the biodiversity there, but also again on greenhouse gas emissions, because those forests do store large amounts of carbon. And again, biodiversity is a huge topic here as well.
Yep.
And if we would move towards more plant-based or plant-rich diets, we would also save huge amounts of lands in the end that could be redistributed towards restoring natural land areas, for example, which again could store
Yep.
more greenhouse gas emissions or carbon.
Mm-hmm.
And water is another issue. I think it was 70% of global fresh water that is used for agriculture alone. So also a huge amount.
And exactly. So I would say all type of food, obviously, require some land use, some water use, and probably still produce some gas emission from transport, I don't know, to the production. So what's, just to better understand, what's the difference between the food impact from animal-based food compared to the plant-based food?
Yeah, as I might have already mentioned, animal-sourced foods are a huge contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions. And we can see across multiple studies that they consistently have the highest greenhouse gas
Mm-hmm.
emissions. While plant-based foods often have a much smaller footprint. However, that also really depends. It's always important to also keep in mind local contexts and regional contexts. So
Yep.
emissions from animal-based foods can look different depending, and also from plant-based foods depending on the region, depending on the farming methods, and yet still it's often much lower. I mean, you could also
Mm-hmm.
compare it to or have a look into more emission-intensive plant-based products such as coffee or cocoa, which also have quite a high environmental footprint.
Yep.
However, are also not directly comparable to meat, I would say, because you use them in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, on a global level, there are studies that show that animal-based foods are responsible for up to 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which
Yep.
is, if we compare it to a country, it would be more or less the second largest emitter in the world, which is enormous. And then, as I think also already mentioned, we have the issue of methane,
Mm-hmm.
especially from ruminant animals, which is much more powerful, a much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. But I think we will also talk about this in more detail. With a more plant-based food system, we could really reduce emissions from food significantly.
Mm-hmm. And for example, I know a lot of people are skeptical about this concept, and usually they say, but processing and transportation and packaging are also very like highly impactful on our food system. So how do you respond to this? For example, we say a lot that plant-based alternatives are processed, so they can also be very impactful on our food system. So how do you, let's say, how do you put this processing and transportation and so on into this big picture on food system pressure from on our sustainability?
Yeah, I think it's an important topic, and we need to acknowledge that those emissions also exist, and that transportation and processing do play a role.
Mm-hmm.
Um, how big the share of those emissions is really also depends on the study and how the system boundaries are defined in those studies.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
the system boundaries define more or less which processes, inputs, and outputs are included or excluded in the analysis of a product's life cycle. Some cover only certain stages, for example, from farm to manufacturer
Mm-hmm.
gate. Other studies have a look at the full life cycle of a product from the farm to the waste stage or end of life, where the emissions often are much higher.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, when we look into different kinds of foods and compare, for example, beef with beans, for example,
Mm-hmm.
we will see that the agricultural stage has a much larger share in the emissions
Mm-hmm.
for the animal-based product, also having much larger total emissions in the end than, for example, the plant-based alternative product. And we can
Mm-hmm.
then also see that maybe the share of processing and transportation emissions in the plant-based food are maybe also when it is processed are maybe a bit bigger than in the animal-based product.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they are similar, but in total the emissions are still smaller
Yeah.
and can likely be also be further reduced with more effective and more sustainable packaging methods, um, with methods of processing, with the kind of energy that is used during the processing stage. If you use renewable energy, you might have much lower emissions in the end. So there's a lot
Mm-hmm.
you can do. And yeah, the farm stage often is one of the biggest contributors to the greenhouse gas emissions in the end.
Okay, that's I think you said a very important thing. So basically we can still work on the process to limit our emission. Instead, it's hard to work on like the primary level of farming. And that's why there is like it gives much more I would say problem on our food system, more pressure and so on. So if potentially we go more close to the fact that we need a more plant-rich diet, how switching from animal-centered diet to a plant-centered diet, what would it change in our food system?
Yeah, first of all, it might be really important to acknowledge, even if the world stops relying on fossil fuels, the way we produce and eat food could still push global warming past global
Mm-hmm.
climate targets. Um, so the emissions of the global food system are enormous. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and when it then comes to your question, there are quite different levels we could look at that. There is the product level, for example. So if we compare a plant-based burger patty to an animal-based burger patty, emissions can be up to 90% lower. Same is true for plant-based milk alternatives compared to the animal counterpart, where the emissions are also up to 70% lower, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if we are putting together multiple food products, we might have a meal. Again, those meals can also have different greenhouse impacts and other environmental impacts. And replacing one ingredient from this meal can already have a huge impact. For example, replacing beef from a lasagna with a plant-based alternative could reduce emissions by, again, more than 90%.
Wow.
Then
Mm-hmm.
we have the level of individual diets. So what you eat, of course, from product to meal to the diet you have over a week or a whole year plays a major role. And there is now a really large collection of studies looking at the emissions of different diets, also in different countries. And again, the results are really quite consistent, which means that for most studies, switching towards more plant-based diets can reduce emissions, diet-related emissions, by up to 50%, and depending on the study, even much more. And then
Mm-hmm.
if we combine all of the individual diets from millions of people and have a look at what happens on a food system level, if we would switch towards more plant-based and plant-rich diets, we see that it can be one of the most powerful levers in reducing global greenhouse gas emissions in total, and also other environmental pressures. What also might be quite interesting, just in the beginning of October, the Atlantic Commission on Healthy, Sustainable and Just Food Systems published their new report with their slightly updated new recommendations for the planetary health diet. And they also
Mm-hmm.
highlighted again that our food systems are a major driver of environmental problems and are also responsible for the transgression of 5 planetary boundaries. And among those are changes in land use, It's about loss of biodiversity,
Yeah.
freshwater use, nutrient pollution, and of course, the greenhouse gas emission that drive climate change.
Yeah, thank you for everything that you said, and specifically for introducing the planetary health diet and the Lancet Commission. I think it's really important because it's one of those reports that, let's say, talk about health and nutrition, and also about sustainability, and as you mentioned, our food system issues at the moment and biodiversity loss and so on. And this is really important. I think, like, as a nutritionist, we really need to work together with sustainability experts such as you, for example. And yeah, we need to come up with more guidelines that work, as we said before, in the big picture and not just on specific topic in a divided way, but we need like a comprehensive view of the world, like to be able to change something in reality. But I would say sometimes it's very hard, as you mentioned already multiple times, like to work with big data, especially when the studies have different methodology, and sometimes it's really hard to come up with some numbers, some concrete numbers. Um, but for example, you are a master in data science and in general in like data collecting and helping people understanding the data. And you are working on a very nice project, which is food system data. Maybe can you explain us what is that about, and yeah, the aim of this project?
Yeah, thank you for this question. And indeed, it's a great project to work on. I mean, as you know, as we're also working together at the research department, we spend quite some time to prepare knowledge, to dive deep into the science, and to make it available to the organization, but also
Mm-hmm.
beyond. And at some point, we just realized that just keeping all this information we gather during our everyday work in internal documents and overviews is a shame in the end. So we wanted to find a way to make it more accessible, and not only accessible for experts, but for anyone who's interested in understanding the impacts of our food system. And that's really how
Mm-hmm.
food system data started, from the idea of translating complicated science into something more understandable, more visual, and also something more engaging. And I mean, there's so much information online about diets, about the food system, about sustainability, but it can be really hard to tell what's credible and what isn't.
Yep.
The same topic can have several angles and different numbers, and this can also easily lead to confusion in the end. And then again, scientific language often isn't very approachable for a more general audience. And with food system data, the goal was to bring more clarity in the end. So to condense all of this complex information, make it easier to navigate, and to provide reliable science-based facts or data in a format that's also transparent and comparable. So
Mm-hmm.
in a way, this platform bridges two worlds, so to say, the scientific depths on one side and also the clear, accessible communication on the other.
Yeah, and from my personal experience, is a great, really great platform. I use it as well on my daily task because, yeah, it's hard to be an expert on everything in everything. So it's good to know exactly where to look for some specific data, for example, on sustainability and on food system and agriculture and so on. And yeah, it can be very helpful, for example, for me as a nutritionist and a researcher. But like, what's the target of food system data platform?
Actually, it's more or less everyone, or
Mm-hmm.
anyone who wants to get a better understanding of how our food systems impact the world around us.
Yeah.
But when we created it, we of course had a key audience in mind when developing it. So mostly scientists, policymakers, journalists, and also other NGOs who work with this kind of data or need to work with this kind of data. And I mean, at the research department, we really love to read through tons of journal papers. Sometimes I don't know if this is realistic, but I feel sometimes like I'm reading 1,000 pages a week or more.
Yeah.
But of course, not everyone can do this, has the capacity or the time to do it. So food system data is also meant for people who want to familiarize themselves with a topic quickly,
Yeah.
to get a solid first overview on the data, and to just access reliable statistics without having to dig through dozens of papers or read thousands of pages.
Yeah, exactly. And I think just to add on this, I would say it's a great tool and platform also for students that as well sometimes are, I believe, are overwhelmed from all these studies around all these numbers. And sometimes science is not really accessible, unfortunately. So I would highly recommend looking into food system data as well for students. And at the moment, what are the main topics that we can find on the platform?
Yeah, currently it's mostly environmental topics, from climate change with different angles when it comes to the full picture, but also when it comes to alternative proteins. We have something on land use, on water use, and pollution, biodiversity, so many environmental topics. But we also have some more interactive dashboards available that allow a deep dive into some of our own research, such as, for example, your reports on the nutritional assessments of milk, meat, and fish alternatives, where we really try to have next to the reports, we create also a more or a different format that allows to really dive a bit deeper into the data. And I think that's something we want to have also a bit more in the future. And we are now also working on a new section which just started a couple of weeks ago, likely when we publish this podcast month.
Yeah.
Where we want to dive deeper into also regional data, because this is also of value for a lot of policymakers to really know what's going on in Germany, for example, or in Brazil, to really have
Yeah.
the more localized information.
Yeah, that's great, because as well sometimes you just find very comprehensive and huge data, but for specific continents, I would say, and it's hard to find region by region. So this is great as well. And yeah, I would say more nutrition content as well on food system data. We are working on that.
Yes.
Yes. And exactly, you mentioned that we have also a page for our report on nutritional assessment of plant-based meat, milk, and fish alternatives. And I'm really happy about it, because for me, data visualization is really hard. It's still something that I need to work on. I'm good in research literature, but in data visualization, not so much. When you said you're very good at that, and food system data at the end is like your baby, and your like the sum of all these different shades of your work. So my question is, do you prefer data visualization, working on data visualization, or on the research literature itself?
I think both have their own kind of charm, and I find both aspects really fascinating. So the research side is where I get really to dive deep into the science, understand the complexities behind our food systems, their impacts, and also the solutions, and then also to make sense of all the evidence that's out there. Mm, And then once I have that understanding, data visualization is more like a creative process.
Yeah.
I also love creative work. I have, I really have to say, and that's then where I get to think about how to translate all that science into something that is more accessible, more visual, and more engaging, so that people can actually connect with the information in the end. So for
Yeah.
me, it's really the combination of both this analytical part, but also the creative part, that makes this whole project so rewarding in the end.
Yeah, that's very nice and helpful for everybody. I feel like sometimes science can be a bit boring, especially when you open those those report of 40, 50 pages. And this is kind of a barrier for people that are outside of this topic. So it's really important to have tools as food system data.
And
And
some
at the
reports even have 3,000 pages. So
true. Yeah, I remember that report on food security, which was like a whole book. And yeah, I mean, it's hard. It's hard for us, and it's hard also for, I would say people outside the topic. And so you mentioned at the moment you're working on a regional level for food system data. And do you have other topic that you're working on at the moment?
at the moment, we are working on the topic of fisheries. So
Mm-hmm.
I think by the time the podcast is published, we will have a new data sheet already online on
Nice.
capture fisheries. Also planning to extend it to aquaculture. And as I also already mentioned, we are working on this new section called regional data, where we really want to cover more countries step by step, where we are gathering data, because we know that our target group really also relies on the data for their specific country contexts quite often.
Yeah.
So this is something we also want to provide even more.
Yeah, that's really important and great. And I can't wait to see the fishery fact sheet on food system data. Yeah, I feel is really important also for our work at ProVeg to have this type of data, especially region by region, as you mentioned. And I really recommend to our listeners to check food system data on our ProVeg website. And I mean, we talk about food, sustainability, and so on. So now my favorite question, what is your favorite plant-based meal? And coffee doesn't count because Daniel drinks a lot of coffee. So
Well, this is the most complicated question for me, because it's always hard to really point on my favorite food, because I think it changes so quickly oftentimes that it's really hard. As you know, we just had this cooking class where we created this plant-based ramen, which was really good. So
yeah.
I already tried to recreate this at home, and it was really good. So I might make this more often now.
Yeah, I would say the same for me. Like I get like 10 different meal per year that I really love, and they change during the time. Sometimes I'm obsessed with something, and then at some point I just don't want to eat that anymore. So yeah, I think it changed during the time. So yes, Daniel, thank you so much for being with us today. I think we talk about very important and interesting stuff, and thanks also for explaining your project of food system data. And as I said before, I really highly recommend to check the project on our ProVeg website. And yeah, I hope it was fun to chat with me in this like different way in a podcast.
It was fun. Thank you so
That's
much for
good.
your invitation.
That's good. And yeah, you can check Daniel's work as well on LinkedIn, I would say. But most of the time he is in the background of our work at ProVeg. So yeah, go on food system data and check his amazing work. So yeah, thanks Daniel again. And thanks to everybody tuning with us today in this new ProVeg Talks episode. If you enjoy, please subscribe and leave us a review. If you have questions as well, you can always write to us, and we will try to cover maybe new topics through your suggestion. Until then, stay curious, kind, and stay plant powered. Thank you, Daniel. Bye bye.